Hello, welcome to the International Business Conversations. My name is Irina Goch, and today my guest is Sabrina Rau. Sabrina, hello, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
It's my pleasure that you are spending time with us, and thank you very much for joining me today. We are going to talk about ethics, human rights, and tech. Can you please introduce yourself and tell me what you do?
Sure. So my name is Sabrina Rau, as you said, and I'm a senior research officer in the Human Rights Big Data and Technology Project, which is based at the University of Essex. And my research revolves on the rights, regulation, and remedies, and the role of businesses in the digital age. So my research is on the role of consent online, the operationalization of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in the digital age, and what effective remedies and grievance mechanisms look like, as well as the similarities and difference between data protection impact assessments and human rights impact assessments.
As I said, today we'll talk about ethics, human rights, and tech. Let's talk about some terminology. What is the distinction between ethics and human rights?
That's a very good question. You often see both of these terms come up quite often in this space, and there is obviously many connections, but also differences. When we talk about ethics, typically it's talk about what one ought to do, what decision one ought to make, or what an organization ought to make. But generally what's associated is what is the right thing to do, or what is justice, what is good, what is bad. But that obviously has much to do with the socio-political context in which it is in, and also the school of thought and school of philosophy that is followed in answering such questions. So while on one hand, ethics provides this moral roadmap to how a decision can be made, there's not necessarily a firm answer to it. And in my research, I like to refer to human rights law more specifically, because it is a hard law. So human rights apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times, regardless of the origin, culture, or status. They're universal. And the basis of this law is from after World War II, the United Nations created the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and consolidated that in binding law through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which dictate rights and freedoms of every human being, which is actually in the law. And it also has a very strong rule of law component, which brings along with it this governance component, which ensures that various actors like governments, companies, and other organizations can be held accountable if a human rights abuse happens on their account, which is a really important aspect when we're thinking about the types of harms and how they could be remedied as well. And additionally to that, at regional levels, we also have human rights courts like the European Court on Human Rights, which enforce binding decisions on states for upholding rights and addressing human rights abuses. So for that reason, in my research, I like to refer to human rights, international human rights law, as a binding hard law instrument over ethics, even though they're, of course, informing each other.
What about technology? Because so we now learned about the distinction between ethics and human rights. What about technology element here? We now have the algorithmic decision-making process. What is that, and why should we care about it?
That's a more complex thing. So generally, I work on digital technologies, and there's a lot of technologies that can fall within that. We can talk about data processing, algorithms, algorithmic decision-making, facial recognition, content moderation. There's a lot of different aspects. And generally at the very basis of that is data and data processing. And we have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which has come into force, and which that generally has a definition of data processing that includes everything from how data is collected initially to how it is recorded, stored, organized, processed, shared, transmitted, deleted. and many other things. So all these different processes of data. And such data can, of course, be collected through a range of technologies, such as the Internet of Things, like laptops, smartphones, but also smart appliances, like smart refrigerators, for example, or home assistants. And this data can be collected in various ways. And algorithms and algorithmic decision-making can be used as a way to make decisions, and those can be automated either with or without a human as part of the process. And to do that, obviously, it uses a lot of that data that has been collected. And even though algorithms are not new, the scale at which it can make inferences about a person and the decisions it can make and the amount of automation is all possible because of the vast amounts of data that there are. And oftentimes, it's an unprecedented computational power that is being used right now that can have severe implications, such as algorithmic discrimination, which can happen as a result of the way in which the data set that was used to train the algorithm and how to make a decision, or the labeling of the data. All of these can have discriminatory impacts at the end. And what's problematic is that oftentimes technology or algorithms, because there's a lot of math behind it, you think is more neutral and less biased. However, many studies have proven the opposite, that there's actually a high amount of error and bias that is integrated into these systems that often discriminate more marginalized individuals and communities. Examples of this are, for example, algorithmic decision-making as part of employment decisions, or education decisions, or even in criminal proceeding, criminal sentencing, where an algorithm decides, who is likely to commit a crime or repetitively commit crime. There's also cases of, for example, teachers being fired based on an algorithm making a decision on their teaching standards, even though how they're making decisions is oftentimes not very clear. So the transparency is very much lacking. So while you have this initial kind of violation of privacy in the way the data is collected and the inferences that might be made, to the discrimination that can be faced as a result of the use of this algorithmic decision making is quite unique for this time and is developing increasingly as a problem.
That is a lot to think about, and a lot of important information. The issue of privacy and guarding our privacy is becoming more and more apparent. But I understand that the rights of an individual can be violated beyond the rights of privacy. So can we please talk about that as well? And also, I would like you to talk about opportunities and challenges that technology can pose to human rights.
Sure. So, of course, when you typically read an article or paper about technology, and particularly in relation to human rights, those rights that are most often associated are right to privacy, freedom of expression, and right to non-discrimination. And those are can also be referred to as gateway rights, because a violation of any of these rights can lead to other violations down the line, such as the right to work, right to education, and many others. And so while we initially talk about privacy, freedom of expression, discrimination, it is actually all rights that can potentially be affected. So while on one hand, you have this tremendous opportunity that technology presents in the way that, at an individual level, we are able to have this conversation online right now, to personal conveniences from, finding a popular restaurant online or having recommendations for travel destinations might seem like luxuries in terms of personalization. There are negative aspects associated as well. To talk a little bit more about opportunities, we have at a greater scale also, for example, for the Sustainable Development Goals, the way that technology, big data, and AI can actually facilitate and help reach the SDGs is really significant. And there's many opportunities in the way that technology can really enable human rights, empowering civil and human rights activism, record human rights abuses, and just monitor and map violations, for example. There's tremendous opportunities for this. However, as I said earlier, it's not only these positive aspects that are associated. While COVID, for example, is a perfect example in the way that they have helped create a vaccine, they have helped with robotics for sanitization, contact tracing apps have tried to reduce it, but they've always had this second leg, mass surveillance consequence or invasions of privacy that can have severe consequences on an individual's life. So the challenges is that a lot of the data that is collected that might initially be this invasion of privacy is that there's also many inferences that can be made about you, including sensitive data such as your political or religious views, or even your sexual orientation. And based on those inferences, correct or incorrect, you may be exposed to different content online, for example, or you may have access to different jobs than other people. For example, if two people were job hunting, a man and a woman were job hunting, for example, they might be exposed to very different types of jobs based on data in which the algorithm shows them the most relevant jobs, even though they're equally qualified. But just because the algorithm was trained based on women having lower paying jobs than men, for example. But this is not necessarily something that you would notice because the content you view is obviously very individualized and personalized, and is not necessarily something you would notice unless seeing it in comparison with someone else. At the same time, beyond individual rights, like the right to work in that example, you also have greater democracy that can be at stake, or autonomy, such as mass surveillance that can cause a chilling effect on people to keep people from going to protests, for example, because they're afraid of being caught on camera, repercussions. So it's people actually changing their behavior as a result of the deployment of some of these technologies. So in a much bigger picture, the deployment of technology by companies and states can have serious repercussions on individual rights, but also on more collective rights in society as a whole.
Is there any responsibility on the company to actually try to prevent and mitigate such harm that potentially technology can bring? And how do the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights fit into this, and why it is important?
Yeah, so companies definitely have responsibility to prevent, mitigate, and remedy any harms they may cause to human rights. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or UNGPs, or RUGI principles, sometimes called, they provide a framework to for companies knowing and showing how to respect human rights. The UNGPs are kind of the first global standard on business and human rights, and provide a framework for states to ensure the protection of human rights from third-party harm, and the direct responsibility of businesses, as well as rights for individuals to have access to effective remedy from both companies and states. And the UNGP framework is focused on accountability through prevention, oversight, monitoring, and remedies for victims. And this is quite a distinguishing feature. And this year we have the 10-year anniversary of the UNGPs as well, which is quite significant, as the UNGPs as an international mechanism have also been taken. There's now work on the binding treaty on one hand, but we also have different countries enforcing, for example, mandatory due diligence laws in various European contexts, for example, where a lot of the aspects found in the UNGPs are translated into national legislation, and making a lot of the aspects as found in the UNGPs mandatory. The way just to get a little bit more background on the UNGPs, is that they don't necessarily create new responsibilities for businesses, but rather enshrine the obligations as already found in international human rights harm. And part of that is for businesses to prevent and mitigate actual and potential human rights harm, meaning that companies have to ensure to prevent and ensure that they know what potential harms could be, but also to know and show that they understand the impact they are already having. And that is as part of their own business operation, but also in their supply chain and their business relationships. So understanding the impact of, how, for example, an algorithm is developed and deployed, but also who they're selling to and who has been involved in developing this, to make sure that they really understand what potential impacts can be. And part of this is that the UNGs provide this accountability framework on this prevention, oversight, and monitoring for victims. And while you have these three pillars on state duty to protect, the business responsibility to respect, and access to remedy for victims, the second pillar is very strongly based on human rights due diligence, to know, and this is the process by which a company can know and show that it is respecting human rights. And core components of that include, initially embedding responsible business conduct into policies and management systems to have a strong human rights policy at the base, and then to really identify and assess adverse impact, such as through human rights impact assessments, for example, which also has a lot of stakeholder consultation and participation as part of it, to really make sure that you have a full understanding of what potential and actual impacts are, to then finding and reporting on mechanisms to mitigate and prevent it in the future, to then, of course, remedying those adverse impacts that they do find and having appropriate process for that. That is the main way in which businesses can show, and particularly in the context of, and while the UNGPs have over the last 10 years have had significant impact in a range of industries, particularly in the textile and extractive industries, there are, in the digital space, they're quite new. And a lot of work is being done in the last few years really on trying to understand what the operationalization of the UNGPs actually looks like in this digital space for tech companies or for other companies employing this technology, because it's not only tech companies, it can be all sorts of companies that are digitalizing parts of their services or using one particular technology with their customers or as part of their supply chain, which must also consider these, should conduct impact assessments, but also consider this broader human rights due diligence process.
You mentioned due diligence process. So does it mean if a firm is compliant with UNGP, United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, does it mean that the firm is also following the due diligence process?
One would hope so. So part of complying with the UNGPs would entail having a human rights due diligence process and having those effective steps that I just mentioned as part of that circular process of an ongoing process. So not only having a one-time assessment of saying, this is what we found to be our impacts and this is how we address them, but rather really having it as part of the process. And of course, the UNGPs and human rights due diligence is important for all companies. However, of course, the scale through which the scales of the means through which it meets that responsibility can differ. So, for example, depending on the size, operational context, ownership, or structure, the means through which a company might have to address and might have a different due diligence process than others. For example, a company with 5 employees with 100 customers might have a slightly different process in place than a company with 100,000 employees and millions of users. And you would expect that process to be quite different, even though those same aspects are included of, assessment, addressing, reporting, tracking, remedies. Are the components are the same as found in the UNGPs. It would really depend on the company, and the UNGPs allow for enough flexibility for companies to take it and apply it in their own, through their own needs, and where it is most effective. And a lot of tech companies in particular can struggle with this because they have so many products, so many users, that applying this due diligence process can sometimes be a lot more complex, or finding one, if we look at consultation, for example, how would you do a consultation with millions of people? Are there alternatives to that? And there's some really good research going on already about how that is done. And that only has been evolving in the last couple of years, and is a really exciting area.
I think there is a lot of things that I get from what you're saying, that there is a lot of emerging trends and emerging ideas that are still evolving, and we are just beginning to learn how to find our way through all those difficulties. In the tech sector, you mentioned that tech sector has their own unique human rights challenges. Can we please talk about it a bit more? And what are those specific challenges of implementing the UNGPs in that particular area?
So on one hand, I do want to say that the UNGPs are, of course, a great mechanism for learning best practice also from other sectors that are applicable in this area. And oftentimes when we think about digital technologies, it almost seems like many people want to reinvent the wheel, that we have to, start grabbing at straws from places to really put together a brand new strategy for this brand new problem. But oftentimes what we do have is we have examples and good practice from other areas that need tweaking and maybe a different understanding. And there is significant work that needs to be done in this area, but we don't need to start from scratch, because we have the solid human rights foundation and we have the guiding principles to really guide us along this way. And the last 10 years of the UNGPs have really demonstrated the impact that is possible. That is possible in this area, and that can be applied. There, on the other side, however, there are, of course, still unique challenges and unique aspects that require thinking. So one of the areas is, for example, you have rapidly evolving innovation and deployment of AI, new tech. And because technology is so quick and many companies are so quick to deploy this, without proper accountability mechanisms or safeguards, that oftentimes it's very hard to keep up with regulation, or even for civil society, because the know-how of how these processes work, what the potential impacts are the companies in the best position to report and share knowledge about how these work, but this is oftentimes lacking, meaning that it's very difficult for regulators to keep up, because it's naturally, the nature of lawmaking is not the fastest, of course, even though I must say that it's been very quick, especially with the new policies and new laws on AI regulation, the Digital Service Act and Digital Markets Act that have come out in the beginning of this year, have been evolved very quickly. There are, of course, still gaps within these regulations, but there are a quick move forward, and we're seeing a lot of regulation, state regulation in particular, come out quickly. Part of the challenge of that is also, however, the complexity of the processes and the networks involved. So usually when it comes to regulation of these technologies in these companies, there's a high level of technical expertise that's needed in terms of how these technologies and algorithms actually work, combined with an expertise in human rights to really understand what are human rights, how do they work, and how do different sources of international law interact. And there's a lot of challenges that come with that as well, because some of the algorithms in which they work, for example, you have this black box AI, for example, because as algorithms, for example, make decisions, oftentimes it's probabilities. And sometimes an algorithm can make a decision or produce an outcome, but not even the computer scientists can tell you how that outcome was reached. And that explainability of AI it's quite scary. But it poses a lot of challenges as to actually understanding how things might have to change. And there's a lot of complexity involved in understanding how it works and how it could be developed or changed, and how and where and how to build in those safeguards. Similarly, in supply chain contexts, rather than having a linear supply chain, oftentimes the way in which a company might develop an algorithm or a particular product or service, on one hand, it produces something for a consumer, but in the end, the consumer and the data that the consumer produces is that which the company sells and makes money off. So therefore, it becomes more of a circular supply chain where the end consumer is not the only end consumer. It's actually part of the supply chain, which is then also which is only part of the supply chain when the company sells to a third party, for example. So it's very interesting in trying to take into consideration how these differences in supply chains work when we're thinking about how the UNGPs apply. Additionally, when it comes to regulation, as I mentioned, we have new regulations that are coming out. We have the GDPR, we have the Digital Service Act and Digital Markets Act proposal, and the new AI regulations that are coming out, as well as at a national level, different AI strategies and such that are coming out and regulating the space. However, we have this huge mix of state regulations on one hand, but also industry and self-regulation by companies, all which create different standards and different initiatives, and can be very hard to keep up with because there are many different requirements on companies in that way. And that's why bringing them together in a cohesive manner to understand, what is really at the core and what are we really trying to achieve is an important question to ask. Another difficult aspect in this area is the public-private partnerships. So the relationship that states and businesses have in this area. So because, for example, we have government access requests where governments ask companies, for example, telecommunication companies, for access to data, which ultimately leads to finding minorities in the population or human rights defenders and then leads to their imprisonment. What is the responsibility of a company? How can they use their leverage to change it? What processes and safeguards can a company put in place to protect individuals from governments in that way? But at the same time, you also have data sharing, where government data is given to companies, for example, health data, such as in the UK. And it's a very unique process and brings new challenges in terms of privacy of individuals, but also implications down the line. The UNGPs clearly state that governments have a duty to protect human rights. However, in practice, governments sometimes fall short of meeting those duties, and however, companies might be in a position to uphold human rights, and finding that balance can be really tricky. But there's some really good work going on in that area as well. And lastly, the last challenge I want to mention is just on the impact and the scale of the impact that might be unique from other sectors, which is because on one hand, you have millions. If you think about social media companies, for example, you have millions of users, if not billions at times, depending on which company you're speaking of. And how do you take that into account when you're developing new products and services? What happens if something goes wrong? What happens if there's a human rights harm? We have heard in the news that sometimes certain data sets have been hacked and email addresses of millions of people have gone public, for example. What is an appropriate remedy for that? How an effective remedy is one that brings an individual back to a position in which they were in prior to the harm. But because of the digital nature, how do you take back this information once it is out there? Is that possible? What would an effective remedy look like? Is compensation an option? Is it not? These are some of the really difficult questions. And on the other hand, you have this invisible harm, if you want to say, which is, unlike in, a textile, a garment industry factory, for example, where it would be quite visible and knowledgeable that a harm is occurring, it's very visible. Us sitting in front of the computer and being exposed to different things, for example, the way that we might be discriminated against in the types of search results we're showing, or the types of jobs that we're shown, we might not know because we only see what we see. We don't see it in a larger context. And there's little transparency from companies on how that works as well. So on one hand, the scale is very difficult to work with, but it brings new challenges with it. But at the same time, we can learn from other contexts, and there are new strategies that are being developed that can be employed to make sure that the UNGPs do work in this space and that human rights can be respected by a company.
I think there is a lot for me to think about after this conversation. My final question is a tradition now. Can you please offer a word of advice to students?
I think advice is always the hardest part. Well, if this topic interests you, I suggest you read more about it. Most news sites now have, a section particular on technology that has the most up-to-date news. Our website, HRBDT, also has a lot of information on these different topics and how it looks at human rights. But I also urge you to kind of look in your sphere of interest, how technology is being used. How is technology used? What data is being used? Are human rights talked about? Is that language used? Take a look and try to also form an opinion a little bit about, what might make you feel uneasy and why might that be? Is there a human rights basis for this, rather than saying, oh, I'm uncomfortable with this, or I don't think this is good? Because oftentimes the language might be very different. They not say, oh, we respect your privacy, or we don't discriminate. It'll be like, our technology is just and fair. But what does that actually mean? Try to figure out whether you can see that, and then maybe compare it to human rights and see whether you can find a solid basis for that. In this way, you can see how technology is useful or is used in your area, and as experts in your own fields, you'll be able to, also create an analysis and see how human rights works within that to really understand harm, but also prevent it in the future.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. It was such a nice, enjoyable conversation, and I learned a lot. And I think there is a lot for me to digest and think about, because you've uncovered a lot of new things to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.